Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Chi-Town Sports Podcast. Today is not a podcast. Today, Ben and I are interviewing Big Ten lead host Dave Revsine. Dave, thank you for joining us. Thank you for being on the show today.
My pleasure, Brad and Ben. Good to be on with you guys.
All right, so Ben and I have a total of about 10 questions. We'll run them through. I'll start. My first question, while attending Northwestern, how did sportscasting on the Northwestern student radio station WNUR encourage or ignite your interest in sports broadcasting? Did you participate in any sports media prior to college?
Yeah, I did. So I would say, most people might have been discouraged by being on WNUR when I was at Northwestern because in my 4 years of college, Northwestern won a grand total of 6 football games and a grand total of 6 conference basketball games. So they were tough teams to broadcast for, but I think it built character in all of us. But I was involved in it beforehand. I would actually trace it back to being a kid. I mean, I literally 6, 7 years old. I had a TV in my room, an old black and white television. You guys probably didn't know there was such a thing, but there was, and I would write down the lineups of. I did a lot of White Sox games. I'd write down the lineups of both teams, and I would literally broadcast the games into a tape recorder and then listen back to them. So I was kind of a broadcast nerd. I mean, I was into it from a very, very young age and had opportunities in high school as well. We really had a pretty amazing setup given the time that I went to high school. I went to Glenbrook North and Northbrook, and we had our own radio station. We had a television station. I did play-by-play for high school football and basketball games while I was in high school in the 80s, which is really crazy. And then when I got to Northwestern, WNUR was really an amazing station. The teams were so bad at that time that even though they did have one commercial station that covered them, the games would be preempted for just about any. If there was a parade or something in town, they might preempt the Northwestern game. So and they certainly didn't travel to every road basketball game. So there were games where we were the exclusive voice, unbelievably. The student station was the exclusive voice of a Big Ten athletic team. So I got amazing experiences. I mean, I did football and basketball games all over the Big Ten. I did a game at Mikey Stadium, at Army, which was an incredible experience. I did a basketball game at Cameron Indoor Stadium. So that part of it was really neat. And I got a taste of kind of what it would be like to be a broadcaster.
That's awesome. Ben, you want to go ahead?
Brad and I are trying to expand into broadcasting a bit as well in high school. And my next question is, after college, I noticed that you took a year abroad in Ireland, and I was kind of wondering how that experience just was like and how it was playing on a college basketball team.
Well, the first thing I would say is that our college basketball team in Ireland, like OPRF's high school team, would beat our college basketball team in Ireland probably by 40. All right. But college sports are very different in the rest of the world. I think that's something that people don't necessarily understand. The college team was just a club team. When there was a tryout, and I suppose they did cut some people, but it was just kind of. I always joke that all of our games there were standing room only because there were no seats in the gym. It's just a different experience. It's not what you would think of playing college sports here, but the opportunity was really a great one. I think the best thing for me about studying in Ireland, I had something called a Rotary Scholarship, which is given through the Rotary clubs. There's Rotary clubs in just about every town, and including I assume one in Oak Park. And they give at that time they gave about 1,000 scholarships worldwide, and it was for a full year to study abroad. And it really expanded my horizons, but I think B, it also really helped me start thinking about kind of who I wanted to be and what I really wanted to do with my life. I was really on a path, I think, to go to law school. I had applied and been admitted and deferred by law school admissions to go abroad for a year. And I think when I got over there, I kind of started to realize maybe that wasn't necessarily what I wanted to do. And so I think that year, the biggest thing it did for me, other than a lot of friendships and the fun of playing basketball and getting to travel Europe and all that. The biggest thing it did for me was I think it gave me some time to reflect and kind of ask myself some, kind of tough questions about who I was and what I wanted to do.
Thank you. Yeah, my dad went to India for a year, and he said it was a great experience as well. Just
Wow,
learning.
that must have been something.
Yeah. So yeah, that's why I kind of wanted to ask you about that. All right, Brad, you got your next question.
Yeah. Dave, you didn't take a conventional sports-oriented route, becoming an investment banker post-college. When you did decide to pursue sports, you paid your dues in Sherman, Texas, and the Quad Cities. While working as an investment banker, though, what changed your mind to pursue sports instead of investment banking?
Yeah, so I would say the big thing, Brad, is I probably somewhat unfairly equated my banking job with maybe what it would have been to go to law school. I mean, I really looked at the banking thing as almost like a stopgap for me to figure out what I really wanted to do. And it's funny when I speak a lot to college students in particular about kind of career paths and how you choose your career path and the questions you ought to ask yourself. And I always say to them, people always say to me, well, when did you know that investment banking wasn't for you? And I always say, well, I had a sneaking suspicion when I took my first water break of the day, my first day. But by the time I got to lunchtime, I knew for sure. It just really wasn't. It just didn't float my boat in any way. I really realized kind of that I was following this path that maybe others had charted out for me and wasn't really being true to myself. And so I think that for me, that experience, I mean, the great thing that it did for me was it gave me like this kind of almost low risk year where I experienced, for lack of a better term, what the real world was like. And I kind of said, okay, it's not really what I want to do. I didn't envision myself. And that's not to say I still have a ton of great friends. One of my absolute closest friends was someone who was in that training program at Chase with me, and he still works there. And he runs a huge division, and he's really happy. And for him, that was the right move. And for a lot of people, maybe it would have been, but I think I came to realize that wasn't really the right job for me. And so I actually applied. I was going to go back to graduate school at Northwestern in their Medill graduate program, and applied to that, was accepted, and was kind of all set to do it. But I had a friend from high school who I was talking to who was doing small market TV in Sherman, Texas. And he kind of said to me, you know what, I nothing against the Medill program, but you're going to spend a lot of money to get a job that pays very little money. I think I could get you a job. And he basically kind of convinced his boss to interview me. And I flew down there on my own dime and interviewed. And the guy basically said, I got 200 tapes here of people who are journalism majors who want this job. When we have a job open up, tell me why I should hire you. And somehow I must have convinced him, because the next time they had a job opening, which was a couple months down the line, he called me. And so I packed up all my belongings. I literally put them in boxes and sent them UPS and bought a plane ticket. And
wow,
I think I might have been the first person ever to go from Wall Street to Sherman, Texas. So, yeah.
That's awesome. Ben, you want to sneak in a question?
That's a pretty crazy story, but I'm going to go a little further down your career. Before you took the job as the lead voice of the Big Ten Network, you were a broadcaster and studio host at ESPN, which is obviously a huge thing in the U.S. I just kind of wanted to ask you how working at ESPN compares to working at the Big Ten Network, and just how working at ESPN was, actually.
Well, so I got to ESPN at a point where, I mean, it was really like a cultural phenomena. I would say this is before, again, it's ancient history. I mean, I got there in 1996. So, no one had cell phones. They didn't have the bottom line on the TV yet, like the score bugs.
Yeah, we even have that.
The crawl, right? So it was really hard for people to kind of know what had happened in sports that day. Like, you would listen for sports updates on the radio, or sports radio stations were kind of starting to take off. So they'd have their periodic sports updates, but there was no kind of central place that you could go. The internet was in its very nascent stages. Not everyone had access to it. They certainly didn't have access to it in their hands. And so kind of simultaneously, CNN and ESPN launched 24-hour sports news networks. CNN's was called CNN SI. It was a joint venture with Sports Illustrated. And they actually made me an offer in probably, I guess it was like September or October of that year. And ESPN had my tape for like 6 months as I was trying to get in on what theirs was going to be called ESPN News. And I got an offer. They were totally uninterested. I never heard back from them. And then I got an offer from CNN, and all of a sudden ESPN was interested, and they flew me out. And I auditioned and got the job. So I was one of the first, I think, 13 or 14 hires for this new sports network. Among the people who were in that first group of hires with me on ESPN News, Mike Greenberg, who, of course, is still there and remains one of my close friends. John Bucci-Gross is still there. He was an original ESPN News guy. I think that's it. That's still there. You guys would know Chuck Garfien also at Comcast Chicago, whatever it's called, NBC Sports Chicago. Chuck was one of those originals. So, so we were like this it was a half-hour wheel. It would reset at the top and the bottom of the hour. And we were just kind of the headlines of what was going on in sports. And at that point, I mean, that was where people turned almost exclusively to get their sports news. Sports Center it went 3 hours a day. There were 3 different shows. And I mean, Sports Center was just the pinnacle. And so to kind of get there as quickly as I did, and I got there reasonably quickly. I'd been in the business for all of 3 years when I got that opportunity. And you're just kind of thrust into the middle of this network that is, again, like, it's everything. I mean, it was where I would have dreamed of going. So it was an amazing experience. And then kind of the trick was to figure out a way to work your way up, to, kind of get off ESPN News and get on to Sports Center or whatever it was you wanted to do, which I was able to do reasonably quickly. I think I was really fortunate that I apparently had some people kind of in my corner, for lack of a better way of putting it. And just had an amazing experience there. And I don't think I would have ever it didn't really occur to me that I would leave. We felt like that was where we were going to be. All 3 of my kids were born in Connecticut. We just had a really nice life there. But then this opportunity for the Big Ten Network came around, and it was really appealing. I mean, the chance to be back in Chicago. I'm much more of a college sports person. And so the opportunity to cover college sports exclusively was really a big deal for me. And then I think just the feeling of at ESPN, kind of frankly, I don't know, there were maybe 40 or 45, something like that, anchors when I was there. And I would say I was like solidly in the middle. I didn't necessarily see, I kind of felt like my path in college sports was maybe blocked a little bit by Chris Fowler and Reese Davis, both of whom I love and think the world of, and have been instrumental to me in my career. But I just didn't see like kind of how was I going to maneuver past those guys. And I just felt like this was an opportunity that I couldn't really pass up. So very different experiences. I mean, at ESPN, you're in this, this kind of huge pond, right? I mean, I felt like everything that happened in sports, kind of, we had a say in it, and people turned to us even more so in that time. I mean, again, I think it's been diluted a little bit with the internet and with kind of all the streaming and all the different specialty networks. BTN would be one of them, and NBA TV and MLB Network and NFL Network. Probably like all that stuff kind of started happening towards the end of my time there. But so just a different experience. This was a chance to kind of be the lead guy, and again be somewhere that I had a real interest in being.
Well, that was a great opportunity, and that's pretty insane that you rose to ESPN so quickly. Brad, what's your next question?
Yeah, moving towards Big Ten football for this fall, what has changed in your preparations and scheduling due to COVID? Quick answer, but yeah.
Yeah, that is that's a great question, Brad. It's funny. I was just doing a preview on the Ohio State Sports Network and talking with their guys about this upcoming season, and they asked me essentially the same question. And the short answer would be everything. I mean, typically in the preseason, first of all, obviously it's happening much later than it typically does, but typically about the first week of August, myself, Howard Griffith, and Jerry DiNardo, Howard and Jerry are two lead studio analysts, have been since day one. We will get on a bus and along with probably about 6 or 8 people from the office, various producers, PR people, that kind of stuff, camera people. And we go on a tour of all 14 Big Ten campuses. And we watch a practice at every school, and that's kind of our means of previewing the season. And then we shoot a preview show. And so you get a chance to eyeball every single significant player in the league and watch them and get a sense, all right, how is Ohio State replacing the key players on its offensive line? And let me get a sense of this quarterback battle at Michigan or whatever it is, right? You get to watch it. And so I always feel we are so prepared. We come into the year and you just know everything. I mean, we talk to coaches, we talk to coordinators, we talk to players, we talk to sports information people on the side while you're watching practice, and it's almost information overload. Like, it's almost too much.
Yeah.
And this year couldn't be more opposite. I mean, I feel like obviously I have a foundation of knowledge. I still feel like, let's just use Michigan as an example, right? When McCaffrey decided to transfer and people are saying, well, we don't know a whole lot about Joe Milton. It's like, well, I can tell you a little bit about Joe Milton. Like, I watched him last year. I watched him practice. I was impressed with his physical tools. I mean, but I didn't get to watch him this year. I don't have as much information as I would ordinarily have. So I still feel like we have this reservoir of knowledge, but it's certainly not as deep as it typically is. And then there's just all the uncertainty of kind of what our day is going to look like. They're still working through how many people can be in the studio at one time, how many people can be in our building. How are we going to do some of the very basic things, logistical things that we need to do a show? One of the examples that I'll give you that is maybe like a little inside baseball or whatever is when you have a highlight that you're voicing over as a sports anchor, you almost never get to see the highlight in advance. The highlight just kind of right, a game ends, and let's roll the highlight. Well, so how do you know what's going to be on that highlight? You have something called a shot sheet, which is, and again, it's been this way. I mean, this is how it works at ESPN. It's how it works at BTN. It's just an industry standard. Someone will run in a sheet, usually a number of pages long, that kind of has, well, here's the situation, third quarter, 3rd and 4, Iowa down by 6. Then I'll tell you what the play was, whatever it might be, 34-yard completion or whatever. And then, well, what's the result? Touchdown, Iowa ties up the game, hit the extra point, go up by 1, whatever. So there's a question of how will you run shot sheets in now, right? Like, because someone physically runs it in. Can they run in and hand you that shot sheet? Is there a way around that process? Like, this is the most mundane thing we do in our business. I've had thousands of shot sheets, literally, run into me from, going back to the days of ESPN. Thousands. I've never given it a second thought. But all of a sudden, this becomes a logistical issue of how we're going to do it. So Brad, it is mind-boggling to think of how different things are going to be and of kind of how we're going to work our way through it. But I think just like everyone else, right? Just like you guys are doing every day in school and your teachers are doing, and so many people in so many different fields are doing, we're going to have to figure out a way to adapt. And that's kind of the challenge of this year. And there's a part of me that has gotten this kind of crazy satisfaction out of when we've done things this year that we never could have done, that we never would have imagined doing 6 or 8 months ago, and pulled them off. I think there's like this different satisfaction that comes from it that maybe is different than I could have imagined, right? Like you just feel like you accomplished something even on a day where you're doing what would have otherwise felt like an ordinary show.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Ben?
So this question is somewhat related to how you were talking about watching players before games or practice normally. Just how often do you just interact with coaches and just media and players? Because when I was reading Al Michaels' autobiography, I noticed how every week he and Chris Collinsworth would interview some players from whichever teams were playing on that night's or that Sunday Night Football. Is that something that the Big Ten Network will do with coaches and players?
Yeah. So most of my job, as you guys probably know, is as a studio host. But I do play-by-play for somewhere in the neighborhood of about 15 basketball games a year. So that's kind of my opportunity to do, on a different scale, what Al and Chris do. I can tell you for football, it's a lot different. I've called a couple of football games for us. And I mean, there you go in and you physically sit down with the head coach, the offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator. You'll have some players come through as well. It's much more structured in football because there's just one game a week. For basketball, it's a little more informal. So each team will have a day of the game shoot around, which usually lasts about an hour. Maybe they'll run through kind of baseline out of bounds plays. They'll run through offensive and defensive sets. That'll probably last for maybe 30 minutes or so. And then they'll spend some time just kind of shooting, working on whatever it is that they want to work on, just kind of getting loose. And it's usually during that shooting time that the head coach will come over, maybe an assistant as well. And you just kind of informally talk to them about what you're expecting and what they're expecting in the game. Are you going to zone? Are you going to go man? Are you going to guard this guy? That kind of thing. And obviously there's an understanding that what they tell you stays with you until the game begins. And then often we'll have players come over too, asked to speak with certain players. I like to try to tell stories about guys, kind of personalize individual players. And so I'll often kind of ask them a little for maybe more background on their personal story, or maybe there's a story I found about them that I'll, in doing research that I'll ask for some clarification on. But the process of doing play-by-play for a basketball game, I mean, that is probably, for me, I'd say there's probably like 6 or 8 hours of preparation at home between watching tape, between getting my charts ready, entering statistics, entering biographical information about players, that type of thing. And then the day of the game, I mean, again, you're meeting with your producer, you're talking about different graphics that you might have. You're meeting with the color analyst who you're going to do the game with. You're going to each of those shoot-arounds. So it's a pretty involved process. It's not necessarily doing an NFL game. I know that is far more involved, particularly the way those guys prepare. I mean, Chris Collinsworth apparently watches video in his basement, pretty much around the clock, as I've read. I don't think it's quite at that level, but it's, it is an involved process. It's not just kind of you show up at the gym and you start announcing the game.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it must be. You guys have so much knowledge with just stats and stories. Yeah. All right, Brad.
Yeah. Even with the lack of preparation, I wouldn't say lack. You still have a great foundation. Who are some sleeper teams and players in the Big Ten fans should be on the watch for this coming year?
Sleepers. Let's see. I might say Indiana. I don't know. Do they qualify as a sleeper?
I was going to say the same thing. Indiana.
Yeah. They turned a corner, I thought, last year. Obviously we're really, really good offensively. And so I'm going to be interested to see if they can kind of pick up where they left off. Michael Penix, if he can stay healthy, is a outstanding quarterback. They have a really good receiver group. Wap Fillier's one of the best deep threats in the league. And then defensively, I thought they really took a step forward last year. They were better than they had been the year before. I give Tom Allen a lot of credit for kind of saying, you know what, I'm going to step aside. I'm not going to be the defensive coordinator and hiring a guy to be, promoting a guy full-time as the defensive coordinator in Kane Womack. I thought he did a good job, and they've got a lot of personnel back. So that'd probably be one I would look at. If Purdue can stay healthy, I think they can be really good also. They had massive injury issues last year, but they have as talented a receiving duo as you'll find in the country, really, in Dave Bell and Rondale Moore. So I'd say those two maybe would be the ones that would kind of jump to mind for me right away.
I agree more. I couldn't agree more. I think I was curious though. Peyton Ramsey transferred to Northwestern this offseason.
Yeah.
Do you think he's better than the current Indiana starting quarterback, who I do not know the name of off the top of my head?
Yeah, Michael Penix. Michael Penix beat him out at the beginning of last year and then got hurt.
I remember that, yeah.
They're both really good. Penix probably has a better arm. I think Peyton Ramsey is the perfect quarterback for Northwestern. He is just, to get someone of that caliber and that experience, the guy's thrown, well over 40 touchdown passes in his career. He's incredibly accurate. He's a proven winner in the Big Ten. He's tough as nails. I think Northwestern's going to struggle a bit on the offensive line, particularly with Rashawn Slater opting out. He's a likely first-round pick, and he decided to focus on getting ready for the draft. So I think Ramsey's a really good pickup for them. Is he better than Michael Penix? I don't know. They're both really good quarterbacks. I think that'll be a huge boon for Northwestern. They need some guys who can stretch the field. I think that's been the challenge for them is, they just don't have great team speed, but they should be much better offensively between that move and then hiring the new offensive coordinator, Mike Kajakian, who has a great reputation nationally.
Last year, Northwestern was my sleeper team that didn't quite pan out. But I blame Hunter Johnson on that. I thought the former 5-star would do some big things, and I didn't see it.
Yeah, he had a really tough year. Part of it, Brad, obviously his mom got really sick, and he was back and forth a lot to Indiana. But I would just also say, recruiting is an inexact science. And while I've often thought you can learn a lot, if a program has a top 10 recruiting class, they're almost always going to be good. So I always think like in the aggregate, recruiting, I believe in recruiting rankings. I believe in team recruiting rankings. But individual recruiting rankings, particularly with quarterbacks, in this day and age, a lot of the quarterback recruiting is done in these 7-on-7 camps and all-star camps. And so there's like no pass rush. He played in Indiana, which is not a great level of high school football, not a great state for high school football. So, did it shock me that Hunter Johnson struggled as much as he did last year? I would say it did. I thought he'd be better. We had watched him practice the year before. He's got a great arm. But, again, there's just this imprecision, I think, to particularly quarterback recruiting that, half those guys, if you look down the list of the top quarterbacks each year, like the top 10, 5 of them turn out to be superstars and 5 don't. And, Hunter Johnson may be one of the 5 that doesn't, unfortunately.
Thank you, Ben.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you on recruiting being in the exact science. I tell that to Brad sometimes because he really looks at player recruiting closely. But this next question is also about the Big Ten. And when I was younger, my family went to a game in Evanston where Northwestern played Michigan. And Michigan won in a triple overtime game, I think, in the pouring rain. And it was just a great time. And while most people don't think of that one when they think of classic Big Ten games, it still stands out to me. And you've been to just a ridiculous amount of Big Ten football games. And just could you give me maybe 1 or 2 that stand out to you that might not stand out to other people as much or remember it now?
Yeah, man, that is a really good question. So, the weird thing is I don't go to that many games because we do the last 2 years we've done our pregame show on campus. And so the first year we did that, I would stay for whatever that game was where we did our pregame and we do some postgame reports from there. But kind of subsequent to that, the way we've done it is I've actually started coming back to Chicago and then hosting the evening shows from Chicago. So I would say not as, not as many as you might think. The one that jumps to mind, that one year where I stayed at the games and was there for the whole day was Ohio State, Penn State. It was, I want to say it was 39-38 or something. That was 2017, and Ohio State won a huge comeback. JT Barrett with a touchdown pass in the last minute or so. That was an amazing, amazing game. Saquon Barkley brought a kickoff back for a touchdown. It was an unbelievable atmosphere. So that was probably the most memorable of the Big Ten games I've been to, kind of while at BTN for football. I've done a ton of basketball games, as I said. And then, some really good Big Ten championship games. Obviously, I've been at a number of those. The Michigan State drive to win the game against Iowa. That was a really memorable one. Great Big Ten championship. I would say the best game I've ever attended in person, college football, was not a Big Ten game. It was the Texas USC national championship game in the Rose Bowl. I did the pregame, postgame, and halftime for ESPN radio for that game. And I still think it might be the best college football game ever. It was certainly the best game I've ever seen in person. Just dramatic, come from behind win. Just blown away by Vince Young's performance and Reggie Bush, and it was just an incredible game.
Yeah, that one is definitely a classic. Too bad it wasn't a Big Ten game, but still a national championship game is pretty nice. Brad, you going to take us into the book now?
Yes, I will take us into the opening kickoff. Dave, you don't sugarcoat the early financial significance college football held to schools. Not many people would think academic fraud and cheating and recruiting were present in the early days of college football. Why did you choose to insert this in the book, even with its negative image?
Well, that was the story. It basically what I originally set out to do was write the biography of this guy, Pat O'Day, who, it seems like you're familiar with the book, Brad. So Pat O'Day was this great early player at the University of Wisconsin, one of the first All-Americans in this part of the country in the late 1890s. And I found his story and was really blown away by it and wanted to tell that story. And then in the process of reading about Pat O'Day, I came to realize there was kind of a bigger story, which was the early history of college football. And I felt like that was a chance to maybe paint on kind of a bigger canvas, for lack of a better way of putting it, and make the story more interesting to more people, which is what you try to do when you're writing a book. So I kind of shifted my focus and made the story about the early days of college football. But what I found amazing as I was reading about Pat O'Day were the similarities to Wisconsin football in the 1890s and football today, and just kind of some of those issues, right? Like, he should have been academically ineligible, but the university president pushed him through. The PR power of college football and the way that these schools were recognizing, particularly Wisconsin, University of Chicago in the early days, recognized that the power of football and used it as a big way to kind of spread the name of the university. So that rang true to me. Finances that you mentioned and how important it was. There were these huge disputes between the schools in the Big Ten over finances and how they would split the gate and who would play home games, whether they traveled to each other's stadiums and how they'd split the receipts when they did that. Again, really echoing a lot of the issues today. It was a major injury crisis that went on in the 1890s and into the early 1900s, again, mirroring the crisis from today. So to me, I felt like that was the story. I mean, it just became apparent to me that to understand college football today, you needed to understand the early days and you needed to be able to draw those parallels. And to a certain extent, it lets college football today off the hook, right? I mean, it's always been like this. It was like this from the very beginning. So I guess it depends if you're, kind of glass half full or glass half empty in terms of how you look at it. But yeah, I think the big thing I wanted to do was change that narrative a little bit around. I think people tend to idealize the past. And so I wanted to show people what the past was really like.
Awesome. Thank you for the response. Ben?
All right. So I've read probably 50 pages of your book. Just started it, and I'm really enjoying it so far, by the way.
Thank you. Thanks, man.
One of the initial scenes is a description of a kind of monumental game between Princeton and Yale, where Princeton pulled a big upset. And I was struck by how different football was then compared to now, and also by how detailed your recap of the game was. So I was just wondering how you were able to research this game. I know newspapers probably had stuff, but just how you got so detailed with it.
Yeah, so that particular game, if my memory serves me correctly, there was one newspaper that sent 20 reporters to that game. It was a huge deal. About 25% of the next day's paper, that paper was the New York Sun. About 25% of that next day's paper was devoted to coverage of that game. And that was just one New York newspaper. And there were, like 30 New York newspapers at that time, right? Because that was the only way that people could get information. Talking before radio, before television, obviously, before long distance travel was practical for a lot of people. So basically the way that you were going to find out about early college football was through the newspapers. And so that's what I did. If you go to the back of the book, there's about 60 pages worth of end notes where I cite every source. And you can just see for that, I don't have a copy of the book in front of me, but for that game alone, there were a ton of articles I looked through in a lot of different papers. And then your job as a historian is to figure out how do you piece them together? Sometimes they contradicted one another. So that was challenging, right? To figure out, okay, well, now I'm going to have to look at a third source and see, does it address this issue that these two seem to disagree on? And then there was a lot of hyperbole in the early newspapers. So that was, kind of sifting through it and figuring out, how to best tell the story. But yeah, it was amazing the level of detail that I was able to find. This was how they turned people into fans. The writers of that day were almost serving almost doing PR for football. They, most of the people I would say who considered themselves football fans would have never gotten to see a game like that level in person. Certainly, obviously, again, no television, but the challenges of traveling to a game, was a big deal. And so most of the people were fans because of the newspapers. And so for me, for someone who's trying to recreate this history, that's a real bonanza because the descriptions are, again, the descriptions of what the stadium looked like. Like if you read the Tribune today, they're not going to tell you, obviously today, no one's at the stadiums, it doesn't matter. But if you read about, a Bears game last year, they're not going to describe Soldier Field to you. You know what it looked like, right? But these reporters, they had to describe the scene. Most of these people had never seen Manhattan Field where that game was played, which later became the Polo Grounds where the New York Giants played. So they had to describe it. And again, that helps me in terms of recreating it.
Well, it was really interesting to read that game. And I just want to commend you on your work in that.
Thanks, Ben.
And Brad, how do you want to end us, Brad?
Yeah, final question. When did you decide to pursue writing a book, and how long did it take you?
Yeah.
Must have been a while.
The metaphor I always give, Brad, is it's like if you're walking outside in a pair of running shoes and shorts and a t-shirt, and all of a sudden you see some people at the starting line of a marathon, and you say, you know what? I've got my shorts and my shoes on. Maybe I'll join these people and run. I had no idea what I was getting into. It was really, I found this story and I wanted to tell it. And I just said, I'm going to write a book and just kind of started going. And probably spent more time on the research than on the writing. I'd say the research was probably well over 2 years. And the writing was probably about a year or so. It was really a 4-year process from the day I first read about Pat O'Day until the day that I physically held the book was almost exactly 4 years. But yeah, it was daunting. It was, I guess ignorance was bliss at the beginning because I didn't know what I was getting myself into. And then by the time I realized what I got myself into, I had already committed to writing it. I had gotten an advance on it. Yeah, I had a publisher. I had a due date. So at that point, you can't really turn back. You just have to go. And it was really something. I'm not, as you may have noticed, I'm not scrambling to write another one anytime soon.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for joining us. Got our questions answered. We got to pick your brain a little bit about all things college football and yourself. We appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure, Brad and Ben. I just say what you guys are doing is awesome. I wish I would have had opportunities to do something like this. Like you guys are doing exactly what you should be doing in terms of kind of exploring this medium and figuring out what it's all about. And I commend you on the job you're both doing. It was a really fun interview.
Thank you so much.